So welcome to the third keynote of the conference. I am very pleased to introduce Tine de Moor. Tine, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to speak at this conference. We are delighted to have you here today and also in the preceding days. Tine is a professor of social enterprise and institutions for collective action at Erasmus University Rotterdam. She earned her PhD in history from Ghent University in 2003, and she also holds a postgraduate degree in environmental sciences from the University of Antwerp. Her research examines the creation, functioning, and evolution of institutions for collective action from the early modern period in Europe until today. Besides this, she has been researching labor market participation and household formation patterns over the past millennium, and has been actively involved in developing innovative research methods through, for example, a number of citizen science projects. Tine's exciting work has been published widely in leading journals. She's also the author of The Dilemma of the Commoners, Understanding the Use of Common Pool Resources in Long-Term Perspective, published by Cambridge University Press, and a co-editor of The Commons in a Global World, Global Connections and Local Responses, published by Routledge. Tine is a past president of the International Association for the Study of the Commons and a founder of the International Journal of the Commons. The title of her talk today is From Institution to Revolution, Collective Action by and Between Citizens and Scientists in Uncertain Times. I, for one, am really looking forward to hearing more about the research agenda, which I'm sure concerns us all. Tine, without further ado, the floor is all yours for about 45 minutes. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for your introduction. I'll start by sharing my screen. Is it visible? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much also for the invitation for this last keynote of this very interesting conference, which I've been able to follow partially, but picked up very nice presentations. Now, of course, it's a pity we're not there together in person, because conference usually is a place where you get to know each other and get to know each other better. However, as Polanyi already pointed out in the 1950s, you can also ask yourself whether the institution of academia as such maybe doesn't even need conferences. Maybe it's one of the most international, worldwide polycentric systems, most resilient polycentric systems that has ever existed. As we as scholars, we don't need any encouragement of a central authority, at least I speak for myself, but I think it goes for many people, to review papers, to give talks like this, to work together. So I think that is something that we really have to cherish as academics. And it is also something, I think, which we can pass on to other parts of society. And today, I would like to introduce you to a movement of organizations. You could refer to them as commons, but I'll be talking mostly about Institutions for Collective Action, which also is becoming more and more polycentric as a movement. And as such, I think I would like to take this opportunity of this keynote to actually make a sort of call for action to bring both communities of academia and that of the development of Institutions for Collective Actions together, by first explaining to you what the emergent polycentric features are of Institutions for Collective Action, particularly in Europe. And actually, my data are mainly about the Netherlands, so I have to warn you that I might sound or give the impression that I'm a bit Eurocentric, but I do see many similar movements going on elsewhere in the world, but I do not always have the right data for that. So my apologies for that. We do have quite a bit of data about historical developments, and I will give you briefly an insight about what we can say about some features of those historical developments and what they can teach us about, in particular, the potential for scaling of these institutions for collective action. What kind of scaling strategies have they followed in the past, and what kind of conclusions can we draw for that? And as I said, I want to take the opportunity also to think about the interaction between that particular movement today and in the past, and us as scholars, as parts of this huge polycentric movement called academia, And in particularly, this is a call for action to also reconsider a way of doing research on, in this case, but it could be expanded, on institutions for collective action. As I will tell you later on, the way in which the current development of institutions for collective action is developing, it makes it increasingly harder for scholars to study them. And as many papers have shown in this conference, it's extremely valuable to study institutions, also this kind of institution. But we need the information to study them. We need access to their data, to what is going on the ground. And that is becoming, at least I can tell you from some European cases, increasingly difficult. I'll try to explain why, but I also try to explain what can be done about this. How can we change our own academic practice to accommodate for this problem to basically solve it. And we're doing an attempt in the Netherlands with a large group of scholars. And I hope it can offer some inspiration to others worldwide to follow and to increase the dialogue between societal partners and academic partners. I will not finalize my talk with a summary, or I will not give you answers. I think I hope to give you mainly more questions, maybe questions that can also be followed up in the discussion afterwards. So let's start with something very familiar to all of us. Of course, Lynn Ostrom has been mentioned many, many times. We all know her work, and the term commons has been, of course, very closely connected to her work, but it has also received much attention over the past 25 years, so to speak. It's amazing to see what kind of journey the term itself has gone through. When I look at when I was doing my own PhD back in the previous century to today, there's a big difference. And I think to a large extent that has to do with the attention given, of course, to Lynn Ostrom's Nobel Prize. A lot of research has been going on, but also a lot of adoption of the term by activists, but also from the bottom up, a lot of bottom up formed organizations that would very closely fit to her description of commons or particular institutions for collective action. Now, whilst this took place, the concept itself has also, of course, been adapted to many more types of institutions. The concept has been stretched a little bit, I think. So now it means it's used as a sort of pars pro toto for a very large variety of institutions and other meanings. I would like to go back to the original meaning of institutions for collective action as described in her book, as governance regimes of natural man-made resources, shared and managed by groups of users according to collectively set agreements. So that's basically the framework I'm going to use. Now, if we look at the situation in the Netherlands, which is of course only part of Europe, but as mentioned, we do have data about what's going on. We see that already way before COVID, actually even before Lynn Ostrom's Nobel Prize, it started around 2005, more or less, this movement. You see that there's a continuous growth of institutions for collective actions or collectives of citizens. And in most cases, they take the form of the legal form of the cooperative, but there are some foundations or associations among them as well. And we're talking here about organizations that have natural persons as members. There's also cooperatives with legal persons as members, but the bulk of the movement, so to speak, is in that whereby natural persons, citizens, become part of an organization that directs its energy, so to speak, towards a very specific type of need in society. That need can be very strong, as for example, in the new mutuals and care cooperatives we've seen emerging over the past 15 years, whereby they react to a situation where there's, for example, no insurance for self-employed. We've seen the bread funds emerge in the Netherlands. It's a sort of new mutual insurance system. But also areas where care is no longer subsidized or organized by the local government. Citizens have taken over childcare, elderly care, and many other types of care and community building. That's on the one hand, the organizations that were born out of misery, so to speak, to on the right-hand side, more those born out of opportunity. Energy cooperatives have, especially in the past few months, received a lot of attention because most of them source their own energy. They're not very reliant on the market, so they could actually keep their prices pretty low as energy cooperatives. So those who joined an energy cooperative before, let's say, March this year, have benefited from lower prices. However, that is changing a little bit because to some extent, they are dependent on the market. But the people who started in these cooperatives or those who followed later on, they often also did so out of opportunity, because it is actually a fairly safe investment, and well, it has not just delivered cheaper energy prices, but also some revenues in many cases. And in between, you have others like the farmers' initiatives. They're really going very fast and right now, whereby, for example, through a sort of franchise model, new types of collective cooperative farms are set up that are producing mainly organic food, and that that's being harvested by local citizens who are also shareholders of these cooperatives. So it's a very wide range of types, and it happens in most sectors, but there's also a wide range of motivations why this happens. And the motivations of members also change over time. It's something we noted fairly recently with a study we did on an energy cooperative in Flanders, whereby we tried to figure out what kind of motives they had for their membership on the basis of a discrete choice experiment. And we got some very interesting results on the basis of that research, I think. If you look at those who became members in the 1990s and early 21st century, it's a fairly old energy cooperative with over 65,000 members. It's quite large. You see that those who joined in the beginning, they actually indicated that they had primarily ecological motives to join a cooperative, and that they are still in it for those reasons. However, if we look at a later generation, we see that those, for example, who joined after 2003 were also motivated for ecological reasons, but had mainly material motivations for membership. And that's also because there's a comparison often made by central agencies that compare energy prices, and well, citizens see that and join the cooperative for that reason. So the reason to join is often also out of opportunity. So there's over time, when these organizations develop, the motivations for citizens to join can also change. Now, next to more physical resources like energy, care, or agriculture, there's also a worldwide development going on, like as in the Netherlands with these new mutuals. There's also a new development of mutual insurance sector, not just in the Netherlands, that we see it all over from China to the US, whereby specific goods can be insured or also for health insurance. So it's not just one. And another interesting example, I think, is the new development in saving mechanisms. The old concept of rotating and saving systems, which is still quite present in countries in the global south, has actually been introduced more and more also in Western European countries, but is also now being revived. For example, in the Caribs, they are setting up a digital format of this. So the mutuality, the mutual insurance system, is also being revived in many different places, and definitely not just in Europe. Oh, well. And likewise, we also see sort of the re-emergence of the worker cooperative, which in some countries has been more popular than in others. And for example, the very well-known example in the UK of the Hebden Bridge Foster Manufacturing Society has now been followed up by a new initiative in the same community. And likewise, we also see the digital variant of these worker cooperatives popping up. Groups like Co-op Cycle that are offering an alternative to Deliveroo and other courier services, but also the Drivers Cooperative, for example, in New York, is trying to set an example and trying to also deal with the consequences of Uber in their city. So there's quite a bit going on digital as well, not just in local communities. Yeah. Now, what do they all have in common, these forms of institutions for collective action? They start from a collectivity of members, and they decide to create a collectivity of resources. And as we all know, what you get is then often a social dilemma. The social dilemmas are, of course, very well known now in society because of the COVID crisis, and we've been confronted with that on a daily basis. However, the interesting thing about these institutions for collective action is that they are not just confronted with it, but they actually seek the social dilemma themselves. They know the social dilemma is going to take place. They do set up the organization, and they try to figure out how to solve these social dilemmas. And that is done through the institution, rules, norms, values, on access and management, on use and monitoring. However, we also look not just at the rules, I'll show you an example of that later on, but we also look at what this does with the values that these organizations start from. And we try to look at 3 particular values that in our model, we call this the cicada model, the Strategies of Institutions for Collective Action model, which are, well, these values are important to understand, we think, what makes an organization resilient over time, not just when it started, but also over time. And then we're talking about 3 important values: utility, so the usefulness of the resource for those who join as members; efficiency, the way in which resources are managed through institutional rules; and social equity, the access members have to the decision-making processes through the rules that are being established by the group. And then the question is, why do people join? Can all members actually participate in the decision-making process? And is the organization actually adequately set up to prevent overuse of the collective resources? Now, let me see. Of course, and I just want to show you some examples of the historical development as well. And for that, to compare over time, we use this model, not just to understand ICAs today, but also in the past. And then we look at a variety of members from owners, consumers, laborers, producers in various different roles. Most, of course, of these members are primarily investors in the organization, whether financially or by other means, and combine this with one of these 4 roles. It can be about many different types of resources: land, food, capital, but also knowledge and social security. And the archetypes we look at and we try to compare over time vary from the historical commons in the agricultural sense, cooperatives, mutual insurances, producer associations, and so on. Now, one of the elements we're trying to look at over time and trying to understand is how what the effect is of size and heterogeneity and variation over time, and then particularly size and heterogeneity of both members and the resources. What does it do with the utility of an organization? What does it do with the equity of an organization and with its efficiency? And of course, if the number of members grows, then there might be an effect on the number of units of resources each member can get, for example. So we try to understand that. And what is already clear, but is often not addressed in research, is that the type of resource also has an impact on, for example, the time window between the contribution, which is described in the appropriation rules of members, or well, in the membership rules, and the actual appropriation of resources, which is often described in the appropriation rules of these organizations. And what you can clearly see if you look at this variety of institutions for collective action is that it's important to understand what the time window is between both contributing and appropriating. It can be very different from a mutual insurance whereby you contribute and you never receive anything because, well, you're not sick, you don't need any help, versus an energy cooperative, which assumes that once you become a member, you also act like a prosumer and you directly consume also the energy produced by an energy cooperative. So one of the issues we're trying to understand is how this time window also influences the resilience of these organizations over time. Now, oh, this is already mentioned. Yes, if we look at the historical development of institutions for collective action, I think we can discern, at least in Europe, three large waves, if we consider the current development as a sort of wave, whereby institutions for collective action developed rapidly in many different sectors, and also spread across large areas in Europe. We've looked at this particularly for the agriculture commons and guilds and water boards in the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe. But of course, other types of institutional collective action can also, have also popped up. For example, baggonages, something specific Northwestern European, whereby women formed collectivities, and their main collective good was actually safety, and also the real estate they built together. But the safety was the most important good they created as a group of women. I'm not going to go too much into depth in these historical examples. I'll show some analysis results later on that I think might be more interesting. The second wave, after the demise of these institutions in the early modern period, took place in between mainly 1880 and 1920, when we see the cooperatives popping up, we see mutual insurance popping up, but also the labor unions can be considered as part of this larger movement in that period. Now I'd like to, and here's a nice example also of the Spanish and the French situation. An often underestimated but very interesting topic, I think, is that of the fishing cooperatives in many coastal areas in Europe, which actually are very inspiring also in their regulation for current developments in that sector. We're currently doing a study on that for the 10th to 19th century with some colleagues. Now, what is interesting to see about these historical institutions is that, contrary to what we have all been made to believe in the tragedy of the commons, but has been rightly disagreed with by Elna Rostrom in her work, is that commons can indeed be very resilient, because these institutions are capable of actually surviving for many, many centuries. So we looked in particular at the survival rate of historical commons in agriculture, and have many examples of their very long development, often surviving over 200-300 years and even up to 600-700 years easily. This is just an overview of some Dutch commons that we've studied in depth, which also gave us much information on how the dissolution took place in the period of that first wave of this early modern period. As we see, by the end of the 18th century, a lot of European institutions for collective action, being guilds in the cities or farmers united in commons in the countryside, they were dissolved by top-down interference by the government, nation states being built and trying to dissolve these organizations. In many cases, they succeeded. And for the commons, that happened, well, in many cases around the 1830s, 1840s, as also happened in the Netherlands. But some escaped, some actually managed to survive longer, as you can see in two cases here in the Netherlands. So a more visual overview of the waves I was talking about, so that we can move on to discussing how they actually developed over time and what kind of scaling strategies they developed over time. And here you see the first wave that actually developed for a long, I can't see this, okay. Okay, yeah. A first wave that took until 1800, when much of these institutions were dissolved, and some of them, for example, the water boards in the Netherlands, were taken over by governmental institutions, or, well, not entirely, but they were kept as organizations because of national safety, but also were controlled more by the government. A second wave here of cooperatives from the 1880s, 1920s, mainly in that period, but also surviving later on and not being dissolved by top-down interference. And a third wave later on, starting around the around the year 2000, 2005, more or less, with a large variety of cooperatives in many different sectors. This is just an example for the Netherlands, but I'm sure we could make a similar one for many other European countries. Now, if we look at these three waves, we see many similarities and differences across these waves. What is similar is that they often react to a period of increased population growth that goes together with commercialization of goods, private market development, and in some cases, not necessarily before, but during the start of these organizations, market failure. We've seen that in several sectors in the Netherlands in the way that's currently taking place. You see that, of course, also in the development, for example, in agriculture in the period of the 19th century. But if you look at the period just before the first wave started, you also see the great reclamations there, population growth and commercialization, against which, for example, these craft guilds reacted. So that's something they have in similar, although it's a bit vague and it's not very specific what the actual reason for each of these archetypes would be. But if we look at the end of those large waves, we see that the reasons were not always the same, and that explains also something about their scaling strategy. The first wave was mainly the consequence of top-down dissolution, and so the influence was also, it should be exogenous, but it should be the other way around. First wave exogenous through top-down dissolution, so interference of governments. The second wave was not because of interference of governments, but because cooperative merged. So many cooperatives simply went together and became larger cooperatives, and thus, lost their smaller cooperative identity. What is interesting to see, however, is that in many cases, the functions of previous waves were transferred to new archetypes of institutions for collective action. For example, the role guilds had in labor market regulations, so to speak, in the early modern period was taken over to some extent by, on the one hand, labor unions, and on the other hand, groups of entrepreneurs who also formed their own organizations. So the labor unions didn't come out of nothing. There was a basis already in the early modern period. Now, if we look at their scaling strategies, this is a demonstration of what I was just saying. It's interesting to go a bit more in depth. If you look at the first wave, you see that there was a specific type of strategy followed by, this is an example of commoners, but I think you would find the same result if you looked at guilds. A rather uncoordinated emergence of these organizations. Their development was also not coordinated by a higher force, so to speak. We see a development there on the maps from around 1200, where you see the first commons emerging in the northeast of the Netherlands, and then in the same area, but unrelated, emerging new ones, and by the 19th century, many of them have disappeared. But there was no communication between these commoners, as far as we know. There was not a copying of each other's regulations, so they had their own local institution building, not coordinated and not in cooperation with other types of commons in the neighborhood. In the 19th century, you see increasing pressure from national legislation on these commons, and then they lose their their right to exist, so to speak. We call this a split and specialized strategy in the development, because as soon as you see a common growing beyond a certain number of members, you see a new common emergence. So they are not striving to scale up their members. They rather stay small and set up a new institution. So it's rather a collection of a lot of new smaller institutions than one institution becoming particularly large. But of course, the fact that they did not cooperate leaves them, of course, also very vulnerable for emerging nation states who decide that their type of organization is no longer apt to the economic development they were striving for. And that's what you see also towards the late 18th, early 19th century, that most of these commons disappear under the pressure of the government. Now, another interesting result, I think, if you go a bit deeper and look also at the rules that go with, well, the rules that have been developed by the members of these commons. Now, we did a comparison of rules of commons for 30 cases in the Netherlands, Spain, and the UK over many centuries, from the late medieval to the early modern period. And we compared these, and we of course also coded everything. And well, the analysis that comes out of this, of the result that comes out of our analysis, is actually quite intriguing. So you see that increasingly the pressure is built up on these commons over time. They are confronted with new rules, new taxes, new interferences by local governments to dissolve their organization, and it leads to what has been mentioned in other talks as well. The law of oligarchy you see emerging here. You see a higher incidence of administrative rules towards the end. So increasingly, commoners have to regulate, but they increasingly invest in administrative rules, so rules about how the common has to be organized. There are lesser rules, for example, about the resources. Those are not increasing. It's really about how everything has to be organized. So it becomes more bureaucratic towards the end. What is also striking in this these particular two graphs is that we see a similar development in the Netherlands and the UK, whereas they have a completely different legal system. The enclosure movement also started at a different time. These are data projected on a period of 100 years. So all the data on the evolution of these commons has been projected in this time frame. But we see a similar development. So apparently, when you're talking about self-governing institutions, the trend is the same. When pressure increases, there's an increasing bureaucratization of these organizations. And of course, this might also have made them more vulnerable for dissolution in the end. And when the focus is no longer on resource management, it might be on something else. We've also done another study to understand, there he is, to understand what the difference is between an environmental shock and a social shock on these organizations. And it turns out, and that is for an organization that's dealing primarily with environmental resources, very interesting, I think, that the environmental shock, the effect of that was probably not as important as the social shock, like, for example, introducing taxes on these organizations. So the introduction of many new taxes as a way to dissolve these commons in the late 18th, early 19th century will probably be a very important part in the reason why they were dissolved in the end. So their institution could not deal with that. This is just to give you an insight in what happens basically if you have a sort of polycentric organization in a way. Well, actually not yet polycentric organization, but one that an organization or a movement, so to speak, that consists out of many small units, but there is no coordination among these organizations. So basically no polycentricity at all. Now, if you look at the second wave of organization, of institutions for collective action, you see something completely different. They do work together, but they work together to such an extent that they also merge together as an organization. One of the most well-known examples of that is the Rabobank, which started initially as Raiffeisen groups, so farmer loan banks that then started working together, formed a cooperative together, but with still a lot of autonomy for the member organizations, and gradually became a much larger group and also dropped their, to a large extent, their cooperative identity. And well, this led eventually to lesser social equity, lesser involvement of the members in the organization. So there are very large organization. They still survived, but their cooperative identity has been, lost to a large extent. And finally, what we see today is an interesting combination of things. They, on the one hand, seem to take, these new organizations seem to take the strategy of the first wave, whereby they want to stay small, these organizations, and they split up when they tend to become larger. And this is also literally what you hear from these citizens active in these organizations. We do not want to become very large. We intend to stay small. But on the other hand, they also use a network strategy, mainly to lobby for their movement. For example, there's a large network on care cooperatives, whereby these citizens work together to make sure they get more involved in the care system in the Netherlands. But the same goes for the energy cooperatives. They have a European-wide network. So they use a network strategy to prevent basically what happened in the 19th century, that they overlooked and dissolved top down. So I think they, of course, I mean, there's not a direct relationship, but they learned maybe from the first experience, and they combine now these two strategies to make sure that they are not overlooked and can continue to survive. So it contributes to their resilience right now. An interesting difference now is also that there's something in between, with a sort of franchise model being adopted, both in the mutual sector and the farming sector, whereby organizations adopt a similar system across the Netherlands. I think somebody has to mute, unless you want to ask a question. Now, the question also is, how effective would this be as a way of scaling? An interesting example there that has been studied, there haven't been that many studies yet about scaling strategies of the current movement of institutional collective action. But there's interesting studies about the German energy cooperative sector, which does show that they had a huge impact on policy, on changing legislation for a community participation of citizens in these energy cooperatives, and that they also contributed greatly to the Energiewende. So the effects on pro-social behavior, on legislation might be there, but it hasn't been studied so far. So lessons learned from this part is that ICAs might have been overlooked as important coordination mechanisms over time in our society, but that they are definitely dealing with direct impact of crises, although social shocks seem to be particularly difficult to deal with. And that that there's, well, let me skip to the second part, that the scaling methods over time have been quite different from the first wave, which worked on the basis of split and specialize, using primarily scaling across, as we would call it, replicating similar ICAs in multiple regions. And then the other two strategies. The second wave, they mainly a merger wave, whereby there was mainly a matter of scaling up, so becoming larger by incorporating other organizations and new members. And the third one is a network strategy, whereby scaling across is also becoming important, but across with, on top of that, a network strategy. So this is what I would like to say about the ICA movement, but what is important to note is also that the fact that the current development, the network strategy, also goes together with a lobby strategy. So the development of networks among these organizations in different sectors also has to do with the intention to change towards sort of lobby organizations for these cooperatives. And it doesn't really help to get access to these organizations. They are often quite restrictive towards scientific research. They are actually even opposing to being studied, although they are very remarkable development in society. There's literally a lot of citizens involved in the organization say, we don't want to be studied anymore, we don't want surveys anymore, we're not interested in scientific research. And this is really striking, I think, and might also be the case for other organizations. And I think we can actually do something about it. I think I have 5 minutes to explain what we could do about this. We're setting up an experiment. Well, it's already running for a while in the Netherlands, whereby we try to establish a more explicit dialogue between those who hold the experiential knowledge, referring to Michael Polanyi's important work of citizens, but also of other stakeholders involved in this wider movement. And we try to establish a dialogue between them and scientific knowledge. This morning, I was giving a talk at the Central Tax Office in the Netherlands, interested in learning about citizens. I think this is also part of what I think maybe as academics have to do, explain evidence-based knowledge about this development to also government organizations. And also contribute to making these organizations more visible, but on the other hand, also demanding their cooperation to work with us to do so. So it's a very time-consuming, intensive, but I think important thing to do as an academic in order to move forward. However, we also need a structure to make sure that this sort of dialogue develops itself. Well, we've developed our platform to facilitate this dialogue. We've set forward one specific principle that is also common to all these organizations themselves, and that's reciprocity. So when we set up the dialogue as academics, we start from the question, what can we bring in terms of knowledge in order to get something back also from them, and that something is their own experiential knowledge, but also data, for example, they collect on their own functioning. So reciprocity is really the central principle in our way of dialogue, and this is an example of what we're trying to do currently in the Netherlands to enhance this dialogue between this new movement, new since, well, a few decennia, and other stakeholders, among which our own group of scientists. We have a larger platform in which we have a number of labs whereby we bring together stakeholders like governments, the civil servants who work on this topic, scientists, but also financiers and network organizations. And we try to identify what needs to be studied and what we can give back on the basis of our knowledge. So it's also maybe a bit of call for colleagues around here to share their knowledge, maybe not through this way, but there's many other ways you can share it, so that we can actually also contribute to a more evidence-based evolution of these organizations. And they reach out a lot to the platform to get information, to set up research. So we try to do that together with them, but also always on the basis of the reciprocity and on the basis of exchange of knowledge through knowledge, text, but also videos, fora, and infographics of various kinds. So we try to sort of structure our knowledge and make it visible. It's hard enough, and it's not always pleasant work, but I think it's absolutely needed to make sure that we can continue to study this movement in society and understand what it can mean, and that from various interdisciplinary perspectives. And we work together with people from public administration, but also history, environmental sciences, geosciences, and so on, as the questions we get also are often interdisciplinary. Now, what I would like to share last with you before I finalize my talk is how we try to set up the dialogue and how we try to do research on the basis of what is requested in society. So as scientists, we tend to come up with our own research questions and sometimes give back our knowledge to society, but we don't always do so. Sometimes also because we don't know what's going on in the organizations we look at. And what we're trying to do with their platform is we try to first identify a number of features of these organizations. What kind of collectivity is it? What kind of members are there? What kind of conditions are set? What kind of boundary rules are there? What kind of use rules? What kind of management rules? Access rules, etc. So we try to identify what kind of organizations is this in a sort of self-scan. And the second part, once we have that information, which basically describes the organization, we currently have the description of about 70 organizations that have joined us since February this year. We can go to the next level and ask them also to identify some features they have. And this is where it becomes really interesting, where we get to know more about the challenges that they face, for example, to recruit members, to recruit investors for their organizations, to what kind of challenges they have in setting up the rules they need to organize their collective, but also how they treat their resources, etc. Now, our self-scan is set up in such a way that the problems that they face are identified, so that they also learn from analyzing their own organization. And they are confronted with these problems that are identified, the challenges they might actually not even be aware of yet. And in a third phase, we offer solutions to these organizations. So you visit the website, you register, you identify your organization, describe it, you learn what the problems might be. Maybe there are no problems, that's not a possibility. And we offer tools to help to understand what the problem might be. But we never advise. We only give tools. For example, it could be a survey, but could also be a discrete choice experiment tool. It could also be a game whereby citizens can use these tools to analyze their own organization, for example, by giving a link to their members asked to fill it in, as we did with the energy cooperative I talked about. And then we help them to identify the challenges they face. For example, the change in membership we noted with this energy cooperative from being primarily motivated for ecological reasons to financial reasons. Knowing this and having this information on a scientific basis, I think is hugely important to know how to build your organization. And we as researchers, we're not going to do that, but we do offer them the data and the report on it to help them think. And the good news is that we do get information from we're offering this to a lot of our organizations, which allows us to then compare organizations on the basis of the same data. So that's how we try to change our dialogue with this development, this societal development, and the organizations behind it. Yeah, this is a very complex overview that tells you how it works, but I will skip this. And instead of that, I would just like to start the discussion. And I hope you have some ideas on how we can take our dialogue with this development of new institutions a step further, and how we can also share our own experiences on polycentric organization and polycentric governance with citizens and with governments. I've heard many times in the talk so far that we're facing very big changes, very big challenges. I think nobody will deny that polycentricity could be a solution, but how is this going to work in practice, I wonder, and how are we going to play a role in that as scientists, as researchers, and for example, in this kind of organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tine, for an inspiring and really thought-provoking talk. We have a number of questions and comments already in the chat, but before I go to that, please join me in a virtual round of applause for Tine. A really great lecture today. So I propose that I'm first going to take the questions that have been put down in the chat, and then we'll go around the room. I will monitor the raise hand function on Zoom. So colleagues, if you could please use that as opposed to necessarily writing your questions in the chat to make it easier. So I propose we first take Sean Turble's question. Sean, you have two questions in the chat. May I please ask you to start by just asking one for the time being, and then we'll come back to you later. I would like to give everybody the opportunity to join into the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Tine, for a huge overview and history of collective action. My questions are really getting down to the nitty-gritty. Is collective action necessarily associated with polycentricity? And how do you define the different degrees of polycentricity to be effective? And it's also the next question is, can you identify examples that may exist where common pool resources investigated by Ostrom and exist in collective assets of cooperatives, mutuals, or other types of collective action entity? How might the design principles be extended? I'm sorry, I got the questions mixed up there. I'm sorry.
No, very interesting. I think I sort of get what you're hinting at, and I will try to answer it, but do correct me if I'm going in the wrong direction. So the first one, definitely interesting. I don't think collective action really needs polycentricity. I think history shows it doesn't. And what we've seen among basically the farmers in the early modern period, the maps I showed earlier on, is that without polycentricity, this model does pop up as a sort of, it's omnipresent in many areas in Europe as a logic, apparently a logic step for people in that particular situation who see the need on the one hand. If you look at the agriculture situation, and then you in the early modern period, you see the pressure growing on farmers to use basically all the land in their they have, but use it in a more efficient way. But you have a need for manure, for example, so you also need pasture land. So in order to keep the balance in their agricultural system, they needed to work together to make sure their pasture land was more used efficiently so that their cropland could be more productive. And that's the solution to that was working together, simply making sure that you have a more efficient use. And if you split up everything in parcels, which wasn't the case anyhow in the feudal system, that wouldn't have happened. Then it wouldn't work. It wouldn't have worked. Also, if you look at talking about feudalism, the local lords had the final say about what would happen with the land. But they weren't stupid either. So they agreed with collective action because it secured their fiscal system. Their fiscal system being built on the yields of the cropland, which needed the pasture land as well. So it's actually a very smart solution to do that through collective action. You cannot exclude that one lord was talking to another and saying this might be a solution for your problem, but there's very little coordination going on between the commoners themselves, I think. And also, if you look, for example, at the guild system, it's amazing how little they cooperated across countries. Actually, they're often their most fierce opponents. So there is no polycentricity there, I think. But it is emerging now as a solution to the problems they used to have, I think. I mean, a similar movement in the early period. I think that's more or less my question to your first point. Secondly, the Lynn Ostrom's design principle list, I think it might be extended, but more importantly, I think we have to also try to understand how the design principles evolve over time when an organization develops. I think that has not been done enough in the past. And I came to that conclusion when we were studying, and I left those slides out because in the interest of time, but I think it's a very interesting conclusion we could do on the basis of the analysis of, as I mentioned, the 30 commons. So we looked at those really over centuries. We analyzed their rules. There's a number of publications on that if you're interested. And one of the things that was really striking there was that the way in which sanctioning was organized. And Lynn Ostrom mentioned graduated sanctions as one of the design principles, but it's exactly that graduated sanctioning that we can hardly find in those long surviving commons. You do find it when commoners get in trouble because nothing else works. So what would be really interesting is to turn those design principles into measurable, over time measurable and followable indicators. For example, when do you see graduate sanctioning emerging, and what does it say about the stress on the organization, on the resources within an organization, because they did use sanctioning, but I think in another way. And often graduated sanctioning is not needed if you have other solutions than sanctioning. And in one of our papers, we also describe how there was, in fact, a relationship between the amount of sanctioning and the longevity of a common. You see that those who survived longest were the ones that invested least in coming up with rules with sanctions. They had many rules without sanctions. So there must be other ways to keep your, to make sure your commoners don't free ride than sanctioning.
I'm suggesting 5 extensions to Ostrom's principles in 30 minutes in my own presentation. So that's the reason for that question. Thank you.
Good. Well, let me know. Send them. Interesting.
Thank you both, Sean and Tina. I've got next Anne Davis, who's asked the question in the chat. I wonder if Anne would like to ask the question herself at this point.
Yes, thank you very much for your excellent presentation and all of your research. I particularly appreciate the historical dimension. So you mentioned waves of collective action. And you also mentioned from time to time different property regimes, like in the medieval period, lords and the manors, or in the 20th century, waves of liberalization. And I'm wondering if a political economy perspective, like what is the history of property, could help understand changes in common, the waves of common. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Very good point, I think. Yes, if you're talking about the existing commons or the current development, there's clearly, especially in the sectors where you see them growing out of need, a very close link with neoliberalism and neoliberal approaches to, well, public goods provisions, and in this case in the Netherlands, but that goes elsewhere as well, I think. There's a very clear connection there. I think, well, it also has to do with, political decisions on the EU level in the 1980s and the emergence of public-private partnerships. Definitely there is a connection there. The oldest forms of cooperatives in care, for example, in the Netherlands, have emerged in places where all provisions previously organized by the government in care were dissolved and were not replaced, as was the hope, desire, and wish, I guess, by other commercial alternatives. And from a market logic, it's of course completely logic that it doesn't emerge because there's a very low population density in some areas. Why would you set up an elderly care home in a place where people don't want to move too far away? The critical mass is simply not high enough. So yeah, I think there's definitely a link with neoliberalism there.
And so the commons studied at the local level need to be integrated with global political trends, as well as global ecology, perhaps. So that's just an ongoing concern that we link these different types of research using your interdisciplinary framework. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Christian Turner also had a very interesting point in the chat. Christian, would you like to take the floor?
Sure. It's a super interesting talk, and it's kind of an overwhelming amount of stuff for me to think about. So my question is really narrow. That you had this one chart where you kind of standardized time and standardized where you don't necessarily need to go back to it. But it looked to me like the chart showed the same general shape, beginning of life, a lot of rule changes, a lot of tax changes, and then a period of stasis, and then toward the end, an explosion of attempts to save the organization. But like there was a stark difference. There were almost like no rule changes in the UK and almost no tax change, or maybe you have that backwards. And so do you have any explanation for why the dramatic difference in response to what looks like there's some existential moment in the life of the collectivity? But I may be reading the chart wrong, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, there is a difference, but in a way it makes it even more mind-boggling that you see the same pattern, that the involvement of commoners was probably lesser in the UK cases than in the Netherlands, because you had the Manor Court that was heavily involved in the organization of commons in the UK, whereas in the Dutch situation, but also, for example, the Spanish or the Flemish and, just continental Europe, the commoners would really be in charge of organizing their organization. And it's probable that the higher number of rules is also linked to the fact that they were closer involved. Because, it's just Austrian knowledge, you have local resources managed by a local organization, so you're going to make rules. And it's quite likely that you have that. But that being the difference between the two ways of self-governance, and self maybe between hyphens in the UK case, makes it even stranger that you see such similarity in patterns. So it says something, I think, about the very particular governance form here.
Yeah, the pattern seemed obvious that as you got toward the end of life, there was obviously some crisis which precipitated it, and there's some rush to do something about it. And people are using the tools either culturally available or organizationally available or governmentally available. And so, it didn't seem to me mysterious that you would see an explosion of something, but that you saw such stark differences in the explosion of what was kind of interesting.
Yeah, but I think one of the main messages to take away here is that at that point, when you have external pressure going up, then the attention of the commoners all goes to the non-resource related regulation making, which is basically probably not what they should be doing, but that makes them weak in a way. And I apologize for not having been more historical. I'm a historian, but it's always with conferences like that, which are so interdisciplinary, it's always a bit puzzling, what shall you say? But there's lots more out there, so be my guest to reach out.
Hanok, you're up next.
Thank you. That's, as usual, really interesting. And I have a few questions, but I understand that the rule is to hold on for one now, and if there will be time, I'll be able to share more questions. So I'm more familiar with kind of cooperatives on kind of the land side, so communes and stuff. And I was struck for many years when I first encountered Ostrom, and then with Ostrom and now with your presentation for kind of in any way, the question is about the dark side of the happy ICAs, I like the ICAs. I think it's a much better way, or the effect of semi-oppressive practices. So kind of Stanford economist Rana Bromitsky kind of showed the significance of lock-in mechanisms for the success of communes, which oppress people in terms of exit. In other contexts, in America, for example, in the US, in the context of common interest communities, you have severe practices of discrimination against on the entry side, so racist and other types of discrimination, as well as in other contexts with more kind of culturally cohesive communities of oppression inside, mostly for women, but not only for women. And there is obviously, for all of those, there is an economic story that shows how that is conducive to success, right? So locking mechanism create a long-term interaction, which is obviously facilitated to solve collective action problems with, the inevitable oppressive consequences. Likewise, our hierarchy, formal or informal, as well as kind of practices that keep out quote unquote undesirables. So if the thought is, and I share, kind of deeply share the thought that we want to kind of facilitate the happy evolution of those types of organizations, at least for me, it's really important to study also the dark side, to include it within the structure, and to kind of see how that can be part of of what is exported. Kind of to refer back to the last part of your presentation regarding the kind of the impact of this scientific work. But the main question is about the scientific work. Right? What is how much of this did you find, and how many ways of overcoming or avoiding those obnoxious practices can you kind of list and include within a happy inventory that allows both a setting that is kind of preserves human rights and so on, and is conducive to the economic and flourishing success of those communities?
Thanks for that question. In fact, it's quite ironic because 2 hours ago I gave a talk here in a Dutch tax office to civil servants, and half of my talk was about the dark side from a present day perspective in that case, and that is mainly about what you see currently is that a lot of these organizations are deciding not to work with the government anymore, whereas the government has the obligation to secure access to public goods provision, which they first dissolved, and then had the citizens taking it over, but now the citizens say, well, where are they organizing it? So, it got lost, basically. So that's an issue right now, true. On the other hand, there's also quite a few of these organizations that, for example, decide to limit profits. For example, there's energy cooperatives that limit profits by allowing people giving easier access to people who cannot afford it to become a member, and also reinvest profits in local provisions. But yeah, that is repairing repair way to solve that issue. Now, I think what is important is to take it out of the more ideological sphere and really look at the economic motivations behind setting up an organization like that. As I just explained in the previous answer, the reason why commons emerged in the early modern period was not because people were so happy to work together. There was a really good economic, agronomic reason to do so. It's the same for the guilds. Now, there's also good reasons sometimes to, economic reasons to make your group smaller or reduce access. Then I think we have to take into consideration what kind of resource we're sharing, because in some cases, heterogeneity of membership is more interesting than homogeneity, and that's often overlooked. So, for example, when you have a mutual insurance system, it's much better to have a heterogeneous membership, because then the risks are spread across generations, across professions, etc. In many cases, when in 19th century insurance companies, mutual insurance companies, were too focused on a specific group, it didn't work out. So that on the one hand. Now, for example, the guilds in the early modern period, they didn't get the message that well either, I think, in many cases, as soon as there was economic pressure, for example, in the 16th century, they decided to become more homogeneous. They decided to, for example, expel women in many cases, but also journeymen were asked to leave the guilds and set up their own saving systems and sort of labor unions in the early modern period. So yes, they have expelled people from membership in order to, I guess, dealing also with exogenous pressures, economic pressure. But what is then interesting is that you see that these again form their own organizations, whereby, of course, they restrict their own membership to that group. For example, you have some female guilds, you have the journeyman's boxes in the Netherlands and all over Europe, whereby journeymen became member of their organization, excluding the masters from guilds. So there's definitely an issue about inclusivity, but I think it's closely related to. It's not true. It's not closely related to heterogeneity. Heterogeneity could explain something, but not in this case. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Just a small follow-up. I think that
I'm really sorry, Anna, to jump in here, but I'd like to give the opportunity to Nadia, who's had her hand up for about 20 minutes. Sorry. Nadia is having some technical problems, so she's going to have her video up.
I'm here. Yes, sorry. I'm very sorry. I cannot switch on my video right now. Thank you, Tina, so much for the talk. It was such a very inspiring overview, exactly. And I wanted to ask if you noticed one thing in particular, because from other research we are used to observe that these instances, these bottom-up citizen instances, basically become successful when they get institutionalized, right? So when they become kind of absorbed by the formal institutional reality. On the other hand, you said something which I also observed in my research, this issue of using rules without sanctioning, so a kind of completely different culture of making things work, right? So I was wondering whether you observed any tendency or any kind of lucky formula with which these citizens' organizations entered some kind of deal with the formal institutions that prevented them from being really absorbed, but allowed them longer survival.
So, well, this would be more about, number 8 in Ostrom's design principles. How do you nest yourself within existing governments? I think, going back to an answer I gave earlier on is that to large extent, for example, if you look at historical commons, their usefulness for local governments was quite obvious because they became a very vital part of the agronomic system. And the same for guilds. Guilds were the economic organizers of a society. And I think to a large extent in the early modern system, there was a sort of mutual understanding between, and in some cases even merged. That is an example here in Utrecht. I'm in Utrecht right now, and here at some point the guilds actually were the government. They took over. I think it's a completely different situation in the second wave, whereby, although of course for the labor unions you could say something different, but the cooperative movement was in the beginning, it was also to some extent a political movement, especially within socialist circles and Christian circles, but was not that much linked to local governments. And I think that it's actually even now moving further away from governments. They're actually often not even seen by governments that this is going on, whereas they provide goods and services that were previously considered as public goods, like local healthcare, kindergartens, mobility. So in a way, I rather see over a long-term time that they become less embedded than more embedded in local government systems. Is that an answer to your question?
Yes, that's very interesting. Thank you.
And you made me think about something, so thank you.
Thanks.
Fantastic. I think we're right at on time. So in the interest of timekeeping, I'll just like to close the session. Before we do that, I would like to thank once more Tine for a really inspiring contribution to our WINIR 22 conference. Very much appreciated, Tine. Thank you so much. Thank you all also for participating and for the discussion. And thanks again, Tine. Bye, everybody.